And we do also have people from different time eras. I mean, we have Banda Singh Bahadur, who was around in the 17th century, then we have Bayam Singh in the 19th century, and so we do have a complete mix of different personalities, many of whom you may have seen before. Now, I want to take you back to, I think it would be good to start at Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Now, many of you probably heard BBC did a poll regarding who would perhaps be the main sort of leader in the world in terms of their caliber and how they kind of led their state. And Maharaja Ranjit Singh, I mean, even in terms of Sikh history, Punjab history, everybody will remember Maharaja Ranjit Singh as being such a great king. Okay, and we do have a few little quotes here. Well, one from Aristotle, which talks about how the rule should perhaps be going about, really, and how to perhaps make a utopia state. But unfortunately, as many of us know, the state of the Sikh homeland of Maharaja Ranjit Singh perhaps didn't exist for very, very long, as we will find out. Now, I do have a little video which I kind of do want to share. In terms of sound, sound. Right, in that particular video, now we're talking more about ideology. Now, if you know your ideology, if you know who you are and what you are, then perhaps coming down to the future, you know exactly what you need to be doing. Now, Maharaja Ranjit Singh is seen in the photograph over here, which was painted by a Hungarian painter, a very, very famous painter. And you can see Maharaja Ranjit Singh right in the middle, and over to his right-hand side, you can see Maharaja Nonihal Singh. And Maharaja Karik Singh on his left. Now, Maharaja Nonihal Singh was the grandson of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And if you could read that little comment over to here. Now, when Maharaja Ranjit Singh passed away, there was a lot of intrigue in terms of in the Ranjit Singh court. Now, there were many, many different factions who wanted to be the Maharaja. Even if we look today, even if you look at the Gurdwara committees here in Leicester, and you have an election, everybody wants to be the president. And similarly, I mean, when you've got a huge empire, when you've got so much wealth, when you've got so much money, somebody would want to take that opportunity if it came. And similarly, what happened? Many of the individuals in the Ranjit Singh's court, many of them were killed. And unfortunately, that's when we come down to Maharaja Dalip Singh. Now, we do have two more different figures here today. We do have Gopal Singh Sira on the far right. He was actually a Kenyan Sikh, and he came over from Kenya in the early 40s and 50s. And we can read what he said about Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So Maharaja Ranjit Singh gave the Sikhs their state, later handed in trust, first to the British, then to the Hindu Raj. But the Sikhs never surrendered their ultimate sovereignty to any power than their own. Today, after 40 years, so he wrote it in 1984, of abuse of their trust, the Sikhs are ready to create their independent sovereign Sikh state. And over to here we have a gentleman called Hukam Singh. Now, in 1947, India and Pakistan were made, and then the Indian Constitution was formed. Now, prior to the Indian Constitution being formed, the Sikhs had put many of their grievances to the government, which included a Sikh, perhaps predominant state, where the Sikhs would be in a good population size and where they would have pretty good control of the running of that particular state in the Indian Union. Now, at that particular injunction, the Sikh leaders at that time, they did not sign the Indian Constitution. So even to this present day, Sikhs have not acknowledged the Indian Constitution, as the Sikh representatives did not sign it. And even he mentions regarding the Sikh military, and even in terms of the governance of the 18th century during the Ranjit Singh period, and even before that, where we have figures such as Nawab Kapoor Singh, who Jaskunbad may have talked about at a previous point. Now, I do want to take you back and just share a little anecdote of the time before Ranjit Singh. Now, many of us would know the Gurus came, and in 1708, Guru Gobind Singh Ji had returned back to Sachkhand. Now, during that particular period, there was a lot of intrigue as well, and there were many sort of disagreements between the people. And definitely, we all know about the Mughal emperors who were around at that particular time. Now, the Sikhs had risen up very, very briefly under Banda Singh Bahadur, who actually coined mint and made letterheads and literally ruled in the name of Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh. Unfortunately, the Mughal Empire was still very, very big and very, very strong at that particular point. And so, unfortunately, the Mughal emperors kind of went on a genocidal streak. And we talk about 1984, a Sikh genocide, but we also need to talk about 1762, where another genocide had taken place called the Vadda Gallukara. And then we did have the Shorta Gallukara as well. Now we talk about the Jews, we talk about what happened to them by Hitler, but we have to remember that we have people have tried to annihilate us, but look, here we are. Now, on this particular point, the Mughals were going on a rampage, killing any Sikh they could find, any distinction of a Sikh they would kill, and they would take the heads of the Sikh to the Mughals, to the police, whoever, and they would earn money. Now, the two Singhs who are literally featured on the far right, even if you follow the little transcript which I've kind of written here, you're getting an understanding in what's happening. Now, they set up sort of a roll toll and said that the Mughal Raj here has now finished, and now the Khalsa Raj will begin. And the Khalsa Raj will be a utopia. And they were literally showing that even if there may only be two of us, regardless of where we are in our journey, we've got that same potential. We've got it in our blood, we've got it in our mindset. And that definitely was a very, very strong message. And then later on, Maharaja Ranjit Singh came. Now, I do have a little quote here from Lord Dalhousie, who would have been the Governor General of India during the time post Ranjit Singh. Now, if you can imagine now, we all know that Gorde had taken literally pretty much a lot of the South Asian sort of continent. I mean, they came from sort of Calcutta, and they had continued rising up towards Punjab, and there was that little vacuum in terms of how Ranjit Singh even gained his Raj and how he became the king of the Punjab. Now, as we've talked about before, Maharaja Naunihal Singh, we had all of that intrigue in the Ranjit Singh court. The sons of Ranjit Singh were killed, and the prime ministers who were Adogre, they were from Kashmir, they had perhaps taken and risen and taken full charge. Now, even if we look at in battles now, you have two different armies, and they literally fight it out. But what happened in the Anglo-Sikh War period, that the Sikh generals who were in charge of the army, they had perhaps surrendered to the British and said, okay, let's have a sort of agreement here. We will tell you our plans, and in return, when the Sikh Empire is finished, then the British will allot the Sikh generals some land. And that's what happened, unfortunately. I mean, even in terms of Sikh circles, there are many, many traitors out there. Even if we look at the time of Guru Gobind Singh Ji and the Chhote Sahibzade, who many of us will know, we talk about Gangu, who had told the Mughals at the time that Mata Gujri, the mother of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, that the Sahibzade are here. So even in terms of Sikh history, you will always find kind of these individuals who perhaps have shown a Sikh guise and appearance, but have actually sort of betrayed. And even in the middle, as we've written, the Sikhs entered the tragic, unsparing and destructive 1840s with blinkers on. And one individual who I do want to talk about is the gentleman over here. And his name is General Shyam Singh Adari. Now, he was a Sikh nobleman in the court of Ranjit Singh, and his daughter was actually to marry Maharaja Naunihal Singh, who was the little individual who we spoke about before, in this little photo here at the right of Ranjit Singh. So he was killed mercilessly, but he was due to marry the general here. Now, as we talked about, the Sikh generals in charge of the army, they had surrendered. they had betrayed the Sikhs. But this particular man here, he knew that they perhaps wouldn't stand a chance at all if they went to battle, knowing that the British know exactly where we are, they know all of the tactics. But the general over here, he stated no. He woke up early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, as Sikhs do, and he wore a white sort of bana, a white chola, and rallied up the Sikh troops, and they went to war. Unfortunately, he became shaheed, as many of the soldiers did, but it shows you the bravery of some of the individuals in our shared history. Now, it's not only my history, but it's everybody in here. These are sort of figures we've had who, regardless of the enemy being right in the corner, right in front of them, they've been very brave, very valiant, and have fought till the end. And even in terms of being a university student, I mean, many of you will have sort of problems if it's sort of revision, getting your mind onto it, which is perhaps a very micro level. But when we've got people like that in our history, then we should be able to conquer the world, really, and even our studies. Okay, now, as we've talked about, the war had occurred, and that continued, and on the occasions during the late 1840s, Sikhs had lost their sovereignty, the British had taken over the Punjab, and the Sikh Raj had unfortunately come to an end. But it's quite interesting to note that even the British, when they had their perhaps rule in America, I mean, that came to an end as well. And even when we talk about Rome being not built in a day, so the political sort of scenery, the political scenario can change very, very quickly. And even if we look at even like South Sudan, and there are many, many different countries who have come about very, very recently, very, very few. Now, to bring on to a sort of a different kind of angle, so we've talked up until about 1849. So we've had Ranjit Singh, and then the British come over, Maharaja Dalip Singh, the youngest son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. He comes to Britain, he converts to Christianity, and some of you may have seen a film titled The Black Prince, which I believe you can watch on Netflix if you haven't, which will kind of detail more about Maharaja Dalip Singh, and will kind of give you sort of footage, and will give you a representation of how the whole saga went about. And Maharaja Dalip Singh, I mean, I was in London on the weekend presenting at the Nishan Research Conference, and Nishan are kind of the London Sikh societies which come under one umbrella. And very nearby, Shepherd's Bush, if some of you have heard of it, they actually have a blue plaque which mentions the particular property in which Dalip Singh actually lived in. And even if you look around the UK, you will find many, many bits of Sikh history. Even Ranjit Singh on his golden takht, so where he would sit in court, they have that particular sort of throne at the V&A Museum in central London. And even during the battle here in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, you'll be able to find cannons which were taken from the Sikhs and are now literally living in London. So we do have a lot of history here, even in the UK. Now, I kind of wanted to put a break into the presentation and talk about an individual over here. Now, so we've talked about annexation of Punjab, 1849, but not all the Sikhs had surrendered. Now, the Sikhs were not defeated after the British were coming in and taking over. You had many, many different splinter groups who would continue fighting for freedom, and they would continue the struggle for independence. And the individual who we have here, now he was part of the Ghadar Party, who some of you may have heard of. I mean, there is a new film called Sardar Udham, which is on Amazon Prime, which many of you may have seen. And you may have heard of the group called the Ghadar Party. But even prior to the Ghadar Party, many of you may have heard of the Namdari lair, where some Sikhs tie a white bag which is quite circular in circumference. And similarly, they reach back to the time of Ranjit Singh. Now, their main saint, who they sort of believe in, was a chap called Bhai Ram Singh, and he was actually a general in Ranjit Singh's army. But he continued keeping the fight alive after annexation in 1849. And then we have a gentleman called Bhai Bharat Singh, another great revolutionary who took up arms and continued fighting till the end. He was later shifted to what we call Galabani, which is the Andaman Islands, which is where, whenever the British would find somebody who would perhaps be a rebel, who could be a problem to the British and their governance, they would literally send them all the way to Andaman Islands or even Singapore. Now, the Ghadar Party, so we talked about migration of Sikhs in the 1950s to Britain, but we do need to take it back to the early 19th century, really. And many Sikhs had travelled to Shepherd's Bush, where the first Gurdwara there was actually made in 1910. And even in America, many Sikhs had gone very early, and they had a Gurdwara in Stockton, in California. So when Sikhs had got out, when fellow native Punjabis had got out to these different parts of the world, they wanted to keep the independence struggle alive. And even in Sardar Udham, you will probably see, if you've seen it, you will see that when Sardar Udham Singh actually shoots Odwaya, that the Granthi Singh, the Gurdwara is taken in for sort of interrogation, and even the gentleman in Punjab restaurant Covent Gardens, which is a very famous Punjabi restaurant, very tasty food. So whenever they came here, they wanted to keep alive the struggle for independence. And Dr. Matra Singh, which perhaps many of you have now read, I mean, he was a doctor by profession, and he went to Japan, went via China and Russia, and eventually, unfortunately, he was literally hanged, as many of the rebels were. Okay, and so if we come now to partition, now, even if you have a quick read here, now many of you will have heard of Mountbatten and the whole partition of kind of how it went about and how Mountbatten had perhaps drawn a line, a random line, as perhaps we can call it, and which literally divided Punjab. And now you have an East Punjab and you have a West Punjab. And that's why you have locations like Nangana Sahib, which is now in Pakistan, and you do have Banja Sahib, and you have many different historical Gurdwaras now, which you'll find in the Republic of India and even in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Now, prior to that, that would have all been one particular land, Punjab, the land of 5 rivers. But it is quite ironic now. If we talk about Punjab, if we talk about Punjabi music, we always keep hearing the word Punjab. But if we look at it geographically, in East Punjab now, you'll only find 2 rivers. So if we look at Punjabi numbers, ek, do, then perhaps East Punjab should be called a Dojab. How can it be called Banj when you've not got 5 rivers? But coming back now to Maharaja Nonehal Singh, who we talked about before, now he was very intellectual, very astute. And he, in his terms of it, in his official documentations to sort of the King of Afghanistan and to other sort of individuals, he would call Punjab the Sikh homeland. And that's back in the 1840s, before 1984, would you believe? Now, partition, unfortunately, I mean, every year when we talk about partition, we hear many tragic tales, and some of you may have read a book called Train to Pakistan by Kushwant Singh. If you haven't, it's a very detailed novel which kind of documents how partition went about and the problems that occurred. Now, partition, unfortunately for Sikhs, can also kind of be described as a genocide. And many of you have perhaps seen Hindi and Punjabi films which kind of document the partition. Or even some of your grandparents may still be around who actually went through that particular carnage. And so the genocidal killings of Sikhs definitely made a huge impact. Now, in terms of the population, we did have quite a huge population who lived in sort of Lialpur district, which is now changed to Faisalabad. So it's a change of name now, which the Pakistani government have done. Now, even in terms of our Nanaji, even my own kind of family history, now they lived in a jak in Lialpur. And they had many different jaks, like you would have jak 20, jak 40, and they would be sort of little settlements around that particular city. And I remember my Naniji telling me that the village, I mean, they were the only Sikhs in that particular jak. And the Musliman in that particular jak had told Nanaji that you guys should go prior to, well, even in terms of 1946, it came apparent that the Britishers would perhaps be leaving. So many people had perhaps made the ayah, that they are going to move now to Indian occupied Punjab, as I would call it. I'm just going to be showing you one more video. Yeah, and the gentleman which we have here is a gentleman who actually lived in London for 21 years, actually. Well, actually longer. Now, he was a democratic elected official in the Punjab state government post-partition, but he actually completed, he was a doctor by profession, and he actually completed quite a bit of studying here in London in 1967. But he mentioned the name Hukam Singh, and I do have a photograph of Hukam Singh here for you. Now, in that particular video, Dr. Jagjit Singh spoke about the promises which the Indians had given. If we talk about Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India. And prior to independence, the Indian leaders had told the Sikhs that, okay, if you stay in a united India, we will give you pledges, we will pledge that we will give you a land in the Indian Union where you can live and you can live the way you want and nobody will trouble you at all. But unfortunately, as we will find out, and as many of you know, what happened in 1984. Now, we're going to fast forward a bit from 1947, and we're going to be talking a bit about the linguistic states here. Now, as we've mentioned, Nehru had promised the Sikhs that they would be perhaps getting a place of land in the Indian Union where they would be able to live according to the way they wished. But unfortunately, that would only come about in 1966. If you can imagine, the Republic of India was formed in 1947, but Punjab was discriminated against, and they only had sort of a Punjabi-speaking state, which came about in 1966, after a very, very long list of different states which came prior. Now, as we've mentioned, Nonehal Singh, grandson of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, referring to Punjab as the Sikh homeland, and even prior to 1947, I mean, if the Sikhs have had a kingdom before, if they've had a nation state, then surely if the British are leaving, they would leave the Sikhs whatever they had taken. But unfortunately, the Sikh leaders had accepted the Indian leaders, the Congress Party, and had accepted their pleas. But as we've mentioned, I mean, it took 19-20 years for a Sikh, a Punjabi linguistic state to be made. Now, that had occurred. Master Tara Singh, who some of you may have heard of, the veteran Sikh political leader who perhaps carried and took the responsibility of many political decisions relating to Sikhs from about the 1920s. Now, many Sikhs were not happy in independent India at the time, and they started continuously talking about an autonomous state called Sikhistan. Now, if you can imagine, we were once kings. We've had Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and we've showed you how much money they kind of got and how affluent we were in the world. I mean, you have Ranjit Singh perhaps giving out gold coins out here, and even if we look at the actual dress of the particular courtiers here, all dressed in gold, and we all know about the Kohinoor diamond, which is now actually in the crown jewels of the Queen. And I talked about Maharaja Ranjit Singh's kind of golden throne, which is literally stuck in the V&A Museum. So we had many treasures back then, But unfortunately, due to time and sort of political decisions, we kind of became the peasants. And many of you have seen the Kisan Morcha anyway. I mean, farmers on protest for a whole year, and the Indian government perhaps not taking any notice at all. Many of you perhaps would have heard, obviously on Gurpurab, when Modi had decided to repeal the laws. I mean, if it was actually an honest mistake, then Modi would be going to single border, and he would be speaking to the farmers and apologising. But that obviously did not happen. Now, we obviously talk about rule, we talk about utopia, we talk about Ranjit Singh. He was ranked #1 in terms of that BBC poll. Okay, and even at the bottom here, I mean, Sardar Patel, he was actually a key Indian Congress leader, and he's calling Master Dara Singh up here a fanatic. And that particular photograph is actually from the 50s in Manchester, and that's at one of the first Gurdwaras here in Manchester. And Master Dara Singh can be seen in front of Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Now the photograph over to here, now we had Master Dara Singh, a very, very influential political leader, but what came after was a gentleman called Sant Fateh Singh here. Now, I'm originally from Warsaw, and the gentleman here in the green dastard is actually my Babaji, actually my paternal grandfather. And this particular photograph was actually found in our family photo album. So we talked about the Punjab linguistic state, which was formed in November 1966. But prior to that, the Sant actually came to Britain. He toured many, many different Gurdwaras here and met many, many different Sikh individuals. Unfortunately, we come to 1970, and the Indian government have kind of put wool over the Sikhs' eyes and have not given the Punjabi Suba, they have not created the Punjabi linguistic state that the Sikhs had wanted. Now, the little news clipping which I've got from here is actually from the Times, and it's from outside the Indian High Commission here in London. Now, many of you will know, I mean, every year they will have like a demonstration in June every year to remember 1984. But Sikhs have been protesting as early as 1970 outside the Indian High Commission. Now that's got to be for a reason. Now the Punjabi Suba movement, it continued, but the Indian government would not allow the creation of what the Punjabis had wanted, and there was actually a hunger strike by an individual named Darshan Singh Feruman. Now he was a Sikh rebel, and there's actually a very famous photograph of him. He's actually in the Ghadar party as well. And some of you may have seen a photograph where there are 5 Sikhs outside a railway station, and they're all chained up. And he was one of the particular individuals. And so he's a rebel. He went on a hunger strike for the fulfillment of the complete Punjabi linguistic state. And after 74 days, he passed away, becoming a martyr. Now that happened in 1970. Now, if we go back slightly to 1969 here, now if we look around, I mean, we can practice being a Sikh. We can wear our ghade, we can wear our dastara, we can walk around very, very freely. But back in the early 70s, 60s, 50s, there would have been a lot of racism back then, and even perhaps some of our parents, grandparents will perhaps tell you of how much struggle and how many sort of problems they kind of had to face back then. And at that particular time, a gentleman called Darshan Singh Sandhu had tied a dastard and he was driving a bus in Wolverhampton and working for the Wolverhampton Transport Company. Now, on that particular occasion, the officials found out and they told him that you can't be wearing a dastard, you cannot be wearing a turban. You have to wear the cap which we give you. And that led to many, many different problems, and it also led to one individual, the president of the Akali Dal here in the UK, stating that if the law is not changed, then I will set myself alight and I will die here in UK. Now, we've talked about bravery, which many of our Sikhs have kind of shown over the years, even now. If we talk, even the world wars, which many people have been commemorating, and you will find many war memorials around the UK. And this literally became quite a big problem for Sikhs here. But very, very fortunately, the Sikhs had worked together, and that particular law was changed. And even the Britishers here, they've taken note of the power that we have as a collective community. Now, look, even today, I mean, many of you perhaps don't know one another, but here you are, you're sitting here equally. Even in terms of Langar, which we all practice, even at universities, but even at the local gurdwaras here. So definitely a very, very important point. Now, as we've talked about, as I showed you in the little news clipping over to here, so Sardar Puran Singh had protested against what he called the unfair treatment of Sikhs. And by that time, I mean, tensions were getting very, very deep. I mean, many Sikhs had perhaps enough that the Indian government had taken them for a ride, and they're still taking them for a ride, as we've pretty much seen from the Kisan Morcha. And they decided, you know what? We've had enough. What we're going to do now is we're going to demand an independent Sikh state. And what we have here is actually a sort of an advertisement which can be found in the New York Times. And that was actually published in October of 1971. And it was on page 12 of the New York Times. So it's quite major. But what was literally written on here is that the Sikhs are now demanding an independent homeland. Enough is enough. If the Sikhs want to flourish, they must now strive for an independent Sikh homeland. And many Sikhs here in the UK had perhaps taken on board that particular sentiment and decided, yeah, I mean, that's the way forward now, that's our only solution. Now, even if we talk about the modern day, we know all about Jagdal Singh Johal, a Scottish-born Sikh man who went to Punjab for his wedding and was literally picked up, and I believe now it might be 4 years since he's been incarcerated. But one thing you'll learn from Sikh history, and history in general, is that perhaps every 50 years an episode will repeat. Now, we talked about the genocide in 1984, we talked about partition, and even prior to that, I mean, we can talk about Sakkan and Ghana Sahib. Now, we did all mark Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Gurpurab, but did you know that where Guru Nanak Dev Ji sort of came to this world, there was actually a bloody massacre in the early 1920s. And the caretaker of the Gurdwara, Mahant as we call it, he actually opened fire on Sikhs who came protesting. And even in that particular injunction, we did sort of have many peaceful protests in order to reclaim the Gurdwara. And the British knew that, okay, if we've got the Gurdwaras under our control, then the Sikhs aren't going to sort of rise up. And even in Darbar Sahib in Amritsar, if you look at some old photographs, what you'll find is a church which the Gorde had actually erected in the complex. So the Gorde knew that if we want to get to the Sikh community, you need to get into their heads. Now, if you can get people into the Gurdwara, I mean, if we go on a Sunday and there's no program, then we're going to come home. We're not going to learn. But if the Gurdwara were free, and then we had some proper translated works from Guru Granth Sahib Ji, then we would know exactly what we need to do and what our Dharam kind of tells us. Now, as we've talked about, many Sikhs here in the United Kingdom in the early 70s, they've kind of taken up the opportunity that, yes, we need to go for an independent Sikh state. Now, the gentleman here, who can be seen holding a new dastar in the middle, now he was actually kept in jail in Punjab for a whole year, and he was only freed until the British government stepped in and made amends. Now, he came back after a year, and the condition set was that he can no longer go back to Punjab. Now, you can kind of have an idea that we spoke about rebels who were sent to Kalabani, the Andaman Islands, literally to get him out of the way. And what does India do? India, if you're a rebel and you go to India, they'll put you behind bars, which they've done and shown during the case of Jagdal Singh Johal. So definitely a lot of pressure, tensions were mounting at that early point. And that led to 1972, where Sikhs had actually in Warwickshire had stated that now we are going to form a government in exile, that we are now going to be pursuing our idea of independence. Now, talking about history repeating, Maharaja Dalip Singh, the youngest son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, when he came to Britain, when he realised that I had a kingdom, I should be a king, even he himself tried to go back to the Punjab and to rally his fellow countrymen. But on that particular time period, he unfortunately could not return back to Punjab. But what he did do was depute a government to work on his behalf, a government in exile. Now, even if we look at contemporary world history, now when Hitler had invaded Poland, what the Polish did, the government had literally established in the 1940s a base here in London. And even if you Google the Polish government in exile, you will find many different photographs of meetings. And even if you go to central London yourself, you'll be able to find where they actually met and where the embassy would have been. And that's exactly what the Sikhs did on that particular occasion. They met in Leamington and they had passed a resolution. Now, we're going to move now sort of to 1984, and I'm going to be wrapping up very soon. Now, we all know what happened in 1984, but as we're living in Britain, I kind of want to give you a little kind of an idea of what actually occurred here in the United Kingdom. So what we have here is a little video sort of showing the anger and the resentment of Sikhs post-1984 June. Now, as we've talked about, whenever something serious will happen, Sikhs are kind of rally around the whole world and they make their anger shown. Even during the Kisan Morcha, many of us perhaps would have gone to London in car rallies to show our support. And similarly, back in June 1984, Sikhs rallied in numbers in central London, where they carried out a very big sort of demonstration. But what you will notice in Sikh history is whenever you've had a genocide, like the Vadda Gallugala back in 1762, when many Sikhs were killed, a few years later, a gentleman by the name of Jassa Singh Ahluwalia actually rose up and they established Raj on a very small level, but they had territories which were claimed by Sikh generals and worked under a Sikh general. Okay? And even if we look at 1984, a whole movement abroad, similar even in terms of Sardar Udham film again, where the Gadri party, even Sardar Udham Singh, where they are organising here in the UK and in California, they are trying to send arms back to the Punjab in order to free our homeland and independence. Now, on the topic of Sikh history in the UK, have a quick look at this video. Now, what we have here is a building in central London. Now, we've talked about the Polish government in exile, but did you know there would have actually been a Khalistan embassy here in central London, which is located near Bayswater, very near to Paddington. And the Sikhs had declared independence and actually created a government in exile, very similar to what happened in Maharaja Dalip Singh's time period. And they had an office here in Birmingham, and as Sikh tradition kind of translates, they would pick 5 individuals to represent the Panch Pyare, and they would work together in order to do whatever they could. And Sikhs started acting here abroad, and most notably, the Ecuadorian government had actually recognised the Republic of Khalistan, the Sikh state, and even an embassy was formed in Ecuador, which I've done quite a bit of research on, and we'll talk about shortly. So yeah, Sikhs, even in Paris, they had sort of an office called Khalistan House, where they would continue working towards the same aim of freeing the Punjab and freeing the Punjabis, which has been continuous. I mean, as we've talked about Banda Singh Bahadur, who kind of first established Sikh Raj, then later was Shaheed, and then we had a genocide, Jassa Singh Ahluwalia came about, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and then we talked about the Gadari Babbe, and all of these revolutionaries that came about, then we've had partition, and then we've had a demand for an independent Sikh homeland, which is continuing and continuing. And even now in the modern day, I mean, you have a referendum, which some of you may have voted, some of you may not have voted, which kind of puts a question on, should Indian-occupied Punjab be freed or not? And even in Sikh history, now, as I've showed you through the quotes, and even in terms of the kind of the narrative, many of you will perhaps come to your own conclusion, as perhaps I have, that history repeats, and it's a continuous cycle, and what we need to do is break that particular cycle. Now, to kind of finish off now here, now I do have a few more quotations here for you, if you do want to have a quick read. Now, we are all students here now anyway, and even myself, I mean, I graduated last year from Aston, and now I'm currently completing a year as a training optometrist. But in order to understand where we're going to be going in the future, we need to understand who we are. And we need to understand that we do have a lot of rich history behind us. And that, I mean, even today on Instagram, I mean, I saw like a little trend, Sikh Lives Matter. And if you post a photograph, people will see it. But you've got to, if we look at our own history, we've always kind of been the protectorate. We've been protecting people. Even if you look at Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, who actually gave Shahidi, he gave his head for the Hindu hill chiefs at that particular time, or the Hindu Pandits, apologies. So we've got to really awaken our minds. We've got to understand and kind of find out, well, who are we? You know, I mean, even if you look at like in Bollywood films, I mean, you'll see a Sikh character, and often he'll be like a joker. But even if we go back to the photograph of Maharaja Nonehal Singh, who perhaps would have been a similar age to us, you know, and in this particular photograph, a very, very young individual, he's got gold everywhere, a very, very intellectual individual. I mean, that's our potential. I mean, we all talk about once we were kings, we still are, but it seems that perhaps we may have forgotten. I mean, even in terms of this particular screensaver, which I've got here, I mean, it kind of reinforces the idea of our bravery and how valiant we are as a community. And that particular scene is a painting from the 1840s during the Anglo-Sikh War battle. And even if we look at Sikh history as well, I mean, every individual who's kind of rose up has kind of looked back at Sikh history, and even Borden Singh, a very, very important literary figure of the Sikhs, who's written many, many different books, which you may find here in your library as well, as I did find at Aston. And he talks about the blue horse and the rider, and he's talking about Guru Gobind Singh Ji here. And even as Sikhs, we remember our Gurus every day. I mean, we might take to Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And so we've really got to kind of work out our potential. Now today I kind of wanted to give you a quick kind of glimpse of Sikh history. Now when we talk about Sikh history, we kind of forget about what happens from Guru Gobind Singh Ji down to 1984. Now 1984 is a trigger subject, but in order to understand 1984, you need to understand what came before. And once you understand what came before, you better kind of, you will have better knowledge and you will understand of why that happened. And it really all comes back down to the mind. Now even if we go back to kind of the final slide which I've got here. Now, I mean, Samuel P. Huntington, I mean, you may find his book here, I mean, actually I'm sure you will, From the Clash of Civilizations. Now the political world is changing very, very quickly and very rapidly. Now if you know who you are, then your future is set, but if you struggle, then obviously that's pretty much life. Now, I know I've been pretty quick. I hope it's been pretty informative for you. Now, I will just show you, do you have internet on here? Now, I do have my own website, so I am an optometrist by day, but in terms of when you do finish uni, and even for myself, I mean, I mean, I perhaps wasn't as confident back in my university days, but I kind of got involved in the Students' Union, got elected into a Student Union Executive Committee, and that's where we perhaps made real change, and that definitely did help me quite considerably. So while you are here at university, fair enough you've got all your studying, but I mean, now's kind of the time for you to explore your own horizons and perhaps start a new a hobby or whatever. I mean, I've been working now since April, 5 days a week in Somerset, and I can assure you that the time which you have now, that time will never come back. I mean, I'm lucky I'm kind of on annual leave now, so I've got a few days off, but I mean, once you get into the world of work, then kind of time goes very rapidly. Now, if you take one thing at all from my presentation, is that we all of us here, I mean, in our genes, in our potential, we've got something very special. Now, it may not mean that we're going to be very brave individuals or we're going to be fighting for a utopia, but even on a macro level, I mean, if we can overcome all the kind of obstacles which we find, then we're doing pretty well, and we're perhaps doing ourselves a pretty good job. But in terms of university, coming back to it and to finish off, I mean, make the most of it. I mean, we probably have many first years here. I mean, don't be afraid of joining a new club, a new society, but most importantly, I mean, take full advantage of what you've got. And just to end, now, I know I've kind of given you a lot of information to kind of think about. Now, even in terms of the gentleman on the far right, I mean, but one thing, especially during the university days, I mean, even his term of writing, it's very lyrical, very poetic, and it's about 150 pages or so. And in that, from reading that book, you will literally be able to cover all of what I've talked about today, but in a lot more detail. Now, what we had back at Aston, so I mean, we did have a Sikh society, but we also kind of formulated a Khalistan society as well. Now, even if we look at universities, I mean, you've got an Indian society, you've got a Pakistani society, but if the Indian government isn't accepting you as they have it in the Indian constitution, then do we fit under a category of Indian? Perhaps not. So what we did, we created an academic kind of organisation where we would have talks, seminars, discussions. Now, we are the future of Sikhs, and it's kind of on our head that one day, I mean, all of these individuals here, I mean, that could be us one day. I mean, somebody could be coming here 100 years later, and it might be one of your photographs which they choose to put up. I mean, that's simply our potential and our lineage. So definitely, I mean, university, enjoy it, do what you need to do, but definitely don't let it kind of go astray. But I hope you've found my talk of some use. Now, I definitely quite enjoy coming to universities to do a talk. Now, I'm part of the same crowd as you guys. I mean, I'm 23 at the moment, so I might be maybe 1 or 2 years older than you, or maybe younger. I mean, we have some sort of older students here. Now, so I've been where you've been not too long ago. And definitely, I mean, once you finish uni, I mean, your life really begins. But remember who you are when you're going about on your university days, when you are out and about. Just remember who your heritage and what's kind of creeping up in your blood, in your genes. But on that note, I will say Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Any questions at all, don't be shy. I mean, I've literally come from the Midlands, so I'm more than happy to spend as much time here. Especially, we're all one family anyway, you know? I mean, if we're all going to God, we're all one family. So don't be shy. I will give it back to Rumni, who can coordinate that.